This is something to talk about from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. We'd like to also mention that Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island is a sponsor of this program. And if you'd like to learn about their day stay or respite programs, or find out about taking a tour so you can see their location on Rolling Bay, call 360-689-4314. Also, a reminder that the Senior Community Center is on Bainbridge Island, the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water. We honor them and we are grateful for their hospitality. And we're also grateful for the expertise of our very own adult librarian in our neighborhood, not the only one in our neighborhood by any means, Tressa Johnson. Thank you, Tressa, for joining us today. We're going to talk about passwords.
Passwords. Thank you so much for inviting me.
As Alan Ludden would say in the good old days, and the password is... you're too young to know about that. But anyway, it was a TV show called Password.
Oh, that's great. So today is the beginning of what I hope will be a series on practical privacy. My goal for this series is to provide some kind of practical tips and tricks to how we can approach internet and online security. Unfortunately, there's no one size fits all. There's best practice, there's practical practice. So my hope is to, through this series, is to just provide real world examples and using a language we understand, a vocabulary that we all understand. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Okay. So today is the first of this series. We're going to be talking about passwords. But before I get started, I do want to thank and give credit to Jessamine West. She is a Vermont librarian and researcher. She created the initial iteration of this talk and invited librarians to use it as a jumping off point for their own discussions with people. And that's exactly what I did. So I wanted to give her credit for getting me started on this. So the thing I want to start with today is a framework that will allow us to talk about online security in the real world. Because as I said, there's no one size fits all. And there's also we use technology in so many different places in our lives for so many different reasons that it's helpful to have a context in which we can really balance our comfort level, the possible threats that we're facing, and what we can do to alleviate those threats. Okay, so there are three main areas or three main questions I think we can kind of keep in mind. So this is about how at risk am I? How secure do I have to be in this situation? So, for example, are you using the Wi-Fi at the airport or the public library? Is the public library on Bainbridge or is it in downtown Los Angeles? Even a cafe in New York City will have a different level of risk than a cafe in Manchester, say. So there's this. So this is a good question to keep in mind. So the information. So an example is, are you on the New York Times website playing Wordle? Or which I love to do, or are you, checking your email? How sensitive is that email? This sort of thing. And So there are a number of actions that we can take. Some of them are more complex than others, and it's better to have a strategy that is going to work for you than a strategy that is so complex that it is, you know, makes you frustrated and that sort of thing. So I want to, we're all going to answer these questions differently based on who we are, what the situation is, where we find ourselves. And I think that this is not very different from how we make decisions about our physical safety. I think that the decisions we make about privacy and security online is very similar to the decisions we make about privacy and security in other areas of our life. So, for example, if you are, well, when I first moved to Kitsap, I lived in a remote area of the island. And when I was at home, I left my car unlocked. I wasn't, you know, I felt fairly secure with that. But when I went into town, I locked my car doors. When I went to work, I locked my car doors. If I left the island, I would lock my car doors. So that's a real life situation in which I've made, you know, I've asked myself, how at risk am I? Another example with home security would be, you know, I've chosen not to have a home security system. I don't think the value of my possessions calls for that degree of security. However, I do lock my front door. So even though locking my front door isn't foolproof, you have to be determined to get in if you're going to get into a home with a locked door. So you can see that there is some gray area. And some folks might be comfortable leaving the door unlocked. I live in a very, not a remote, but a very quiet part of the town. So how we each approach these questions, these situations that we find ourselves online are all going to be different. So bringing it back to technology and internet security, if you are a doctor, a lawyer, a librarian, you may be governed by laws that or professional guidelines that tell you how safe you need to keep the information that you're working with. If you are in an unstable situation at home, if your immigration status is unstable, or maybe you just want to keep your private life private, those will all impact your answers to these questions. Or maybe you don't really care very much, but you want to be able to shop on Amazon without your partner knowing what you're purchasing, right? So we're all very different. So this gives us a context in which to make decisions about, in today's case, about passwords. Okay, so let's see. So I'm going to be talking about creating passwords, managing passwords, and then I have one bonus piece of information. So we all know this piece. We've all heard it quite a bit.
I should stop using my birth date as my password.
Yeah. See, that would be a good idea. No personal information, no, you know, street names or profession or numbers. But what we can do is use a passphrase, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And to talk about the passphrase and why we should use it and what that exactly means, I'm going to go to a comic that we're going to look at it cell by cell. We've been told for years to create passwords that have random capital letters, numbers in place of letters, and this is if somebody is determined to hack into our personal information, they are most likely not going to be guessing our passwords with their brains. They're going to be using a computer. So the question is, how hard is it for a computer to discover this password? And as it turns out, it's not that hard for a computer to guess what this password is. So by using a password with this framework, we've managed to create something that is easy for a computer, but not very easy to remember for us. So to make passwords that are easier to remember, what we want to do is create a passphrase. So that's a set of words that on the surface, they seem unrelated, but they have meaning to you. So taking 3 or 4 words and putting them together is easy for our eyes to see. We can look at those 4 words together, even without a space, and we can determine what those words are. But for a computer, it's very challenging. It's difficult. And again, if someone is determined to get past a password, they will be using that computer. So how do you remember it? You can create a scenario that you remember that makes you laugh, or you know, whatever it is. We can memorize it.
I know that I've heard this in terms of remembering people's names. The idea that if somebody's name is Patty, you might think of them as a hamburger, and then you're stuck with that thought in your head. Oh, that's Patty. And you don't tell her that's what you're thinking about, but or him, but there you go. And so you could do something like that, where you're thinking of some odd combination, which is easy for your brain. It's kind of interesting about this, because I wonder, often my website asks me to include names, numbers, weird things, and you're saying that I could probably do it with just regular words.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. And some websites will require that you add another character or a letter. And for that reason, I'm going to talk about password management, because although we are, you know, the idea is to create passwords that are easy to remember, difficult for a computer to figure out, but easy for us to remember, we still have so many places in which we need a password. So for those that require a numeral or a special character like an ampersand or a star, we still need some kind of management process. So I'm going to talk about that. Writing down passwords is not a best practice, as we all have been told. However, I think it is a practical practice. Now, there are some caveats, which I'm going to talk about, but writing down passwords, it's much safer than having a password that you never change, or using one password for everything. For many people in many contexts, having a notebook with all of your passwords in it is really the best option. You want to keep it as safe as you might your wallet or your credit card. You probably don't want to keep it in your wallet, but you know, just keeping it safe at home, and you know where to find it. Now, the caveats. I open with this because ask me how I know that this is really helpful to keep everything in a notebook. Having things on little slips of paper, which is might be convenient at the time when you're creating the password, is not a good storage technique, I've discovered. Using Post-its. It really, you know, it doesn't have to be a special notebook. You can go to Waterfront Thrift and pick one up for not, you know, a small amount of money. But that notebook, if you only keep passwords in it, you keep it in a special place, it has a special purpose. It's very helpful. Actually, all of these caveats I have personal experience with. Writing legibly, it seems obvious, but it's especially sometimes with technology, if we're in a situation where we feel hurried or are stressed, this is a good point to remember. If you do have, I personally underscore my capital letters in my in all of my passwords. That may or may not work for other people, whatever works for you, but I found it is helpful to have a system so that you know when you have a capital O and a lowercase o versus a 0 if you have to add a numeral. You want to have a system that you can remember. Sometimes we are asked to answer some questions. You know, what's the name of your favorite pet, or your mother's maiden name? And I discovered for myself that sometimes I was using capital letters, sometimes I wasn't. Sometimes I'd give, I'd use the word drive. Sometimes I would just use DR. So now I don't write down the questions. I just write down the answers so that I remember exactly how I answered things. And this is in my password notebook, in my little notebook. This is actually very helpful. I have found as I use the notebook, it becomes less organized as I use it, and it is very helpful if I note the date. If I reset a password, I need to know, well, oh, this says Amazon and that says Amazon. I don't know which one is accurate. Well, if you've written down the date, then that is much easier. And this is key. I personally do this once a year. I have a lot of passwords, and I just pick up another 50-cent notebook and go through and rewrite them. I rewrite them legibly. I make sure everything is up to date and clear. It's extremely helpful. So that's management. Now there is another technique that you could use, which is a password manager. Now, if you are someone that has a large number of passwords, if you own your own device, this may be a good strategy for you. A password manager is software that it's inexpensive, it can be inexpensive, and it creates and stores the passwords for you. So I think of this like a safe. You have one combination that you need to remember, but once you open the safe, you have access to everything that's inside. And that's how a password manager works. You create and remember one very secure, very difficult password, but you use that password to get in, and then the password manager keeps all of those passwords safe. Now, if that's something that you think may be a good fit for you, a good strategy, the Senior Community Center hosts volunteer John Chen on Mondays, and soon some volunteers from Bainbridge Youth Services will be joining him. You can call the Senior Community Center at 842-1616 and get on a wait list. He is very clear. He's very good. I mean, I think he's very good, but I have people come into the library and thank me for suggesting that they make an appointment with John. He's really great. So the bonus tip is two-factor authentication. This is when you log in with your password and then you have to do this other thing. So when I was talking about having to answer questions about your first pet, your mother's maiden name, that is an example of two-factor authentication. Other examples, when they, you put in your password and then they text you a code or email you a code, and you have to put that code in the website in order to actually get in. The idea is that even if somebody gets hold of your password, they won't also have access to that second thing. This is a very good way of further protecting your information. It's a step that you can take for just an extra layer of security. Some people don't have cell phones. You can set up a second email account that is intended only for as a two-factor authentication. So when you're signing up with a website and it asks for your an email address, you can give it this second email address. And again, if you're interested in learning more about this, or if you have questions about this, John is a great resource. We're really fortunate to have him. So I'm gonna leave it there. I do have some resources here. A video that I thought was very helpful. Names of password managers that are both highly, they are repeatedly in kind of lists of recommended password managers. Information about getting in touch with John and information about getting in touch with me as well.
And we just got a message saying hard to sort through Google password logs and other logs of passwords. Yes. And agree. Yeah. Any thoughts or comments on that, Tressa?
Google does a great job of, it's really working hard to secure our information. And sometimes that can be very frustrating. They routinely require two-factor authentication, which can be very frustrating when all you want to do is create a password. Chrome, which is the browser that was created by Google, has an internal mechanism for remembering all of the passwords that you use, and that can be it can be a little bit awkward. Yeah, it's challenging. I just personally, for myself, in my professional life as a librarian, I use a password manager that is extremely secure. It's provided by Kitsap Regional Library. I'm working with information that is not my own. In my private life, I find that my notebook, writing them down, is really the best strategy for me. And part of it is the challenge with using these password saving actions that have been built into our browsers.
I'm just thinking, when we get notifications that our password has been compromised in some way, one, how do we know whether it's legitimate or not, or whether it's sort of like phishing for us to click on? Do you have, if that's a bigger topic, we can earmark it for another time, but if you have any thoughts on that.
It's such an excellent question, and I'm actually going to cover that in a different part of the series, because there are there are ways that one can take to check that, to see where that email is coming from. It depends on the service that you're using. So for today, I really wanted to focus on just creating and managing passwords. But Katie, it's an excellent question, and one I had. I'm glad to hear you ask it, because it means that I am I'm on the right track in terms of thinking about what I want to talk about in the future.
Okay, excellent. All right, so anyone else who is also curious as to how do we know when legitimately our information passwords have been compromised versus when we're being kind of fraudulently pulled in, stay tuned. It sounds like Tressa is already on it, and so we'll look forward to having that conversation. Yeah.
They've become very very slick at making you think that it is really important. And you opening the email is safe. Moving it into a file is safe. Clicking on a link inside an email is not. You never want to do that. Just as kind of a quick thing is to, instead of responding to the email, go online and find an email address for that company and open up a brand new email and say, hey, this is what I got. This is, did you send this?
If it doesn't sit well with you, go back to your own records. You know, if it's your bank, you know, don't rely on the phone number, the link that they're telling you to click on. Go to your own account, your records, you know, any documents that you have, and use that phone number, that information to follow up and contact. So again, we'll save this for another, you know, another conversation, so we can really kind of dive into it. But I appreciate that. Any other questions for Tressa? Marcy, yes.
Yeah. Okay. I have two that for the future. One of them is the user ID. I need to go back and start to have more complicated user IDs. So I'd like a little more information on what Tressa thinks about the user ID. The other thing is keeping this notebook. I do it on Excel on my computer. And what I don't know, is that safe? Is there any official information about how safe is how is your computer safe enough to keep all those passwords in a program on the computer? I've used LastPass for many years, so it is also on LastPass, but I keep the spreadsheet that I can see and update on the computer as an Excel spreadsheet. So I don't know how safe that is, and I've never thought about it until today as to whether that's the safest or not safe.
Well, and part of the answer to that, that's a great question. And I did make a note of it so I can come back to it, because there are a couple of different layers. As part of the answer to that question goes back to the threat model, that context that we provided. So if you only use your computer at home, if your Wi-Fi or internet connection is locked, it's probably pretty safe. If you have, you know, are you using the Wi-Fi at the library or at the airport? I mean, there's some decisions like that. But I'll think about some different, and I have got my email, my phone number there, Marcy. If you think of other questions along those lines, please reach out to me, or anyone who's watching this video later, feel free to reach out to me. I want to, those are the kinds of questions that I would like to address in a way that is truly helpful.